experience. So good afternoon to you all, everybody. My name is Natalie Ashdown from the Open Door Coaching Group, and on behalf of my team and the team at Synergy Global, it's an absolute pleasure to introduce this keynote presentation for you as part of our Coach Week conference. And this afternoon, we're talking about performance conversations, why we need more, I beg your pardon, why we need different, not more. That's right. And with me, just before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and acknowledge, thanks Deborah, that's okay.
So no, it's not.
She's just going to tab the screen.
Yeah, but I've done something terrible and I don't know what.
That's right. You can use the arrows, sometimes help.
Yes, if I could find them. I'm sorry about this, everybody.
That's right, all your arrows on your keyboard.
I could see them before. No, that's not working. And I could see them before and now it's not working.
That's all right. Take your time.
But you can still see it, can't you?
Yeah, we can see your screen, yeah.
Ah, there we go. Okay. Okay, I think it's working now. Can you see it now?
Have you moved to the
yes.
Next slide?
Yes, I have. Do you want to take it back and run it? Because I can now see the next slide, but I can't see.
That's odd, isn't it? Okay, everybody, just bear with us while we just solve this technical glitch. So yeah, I can't see the slide has clicked over, but you've clicked it over, obviously.
I have. I tell you what, and I just realized that, yes, okay. So sorry everybody, can I hand back the host to you and you do it and change it?
Yeah,
would that
absolutely.
be better?
Yeah, for sure we can, no problem.
Well, you say that, how do I do it?
I'm going to request it back off you. Give it back.
I'm very sorry about
Reclaim the host. There you go.
Okay.
Okay, so just wait me a second. I'll just bring up my screen.
Okay, so I can see it now. I'm assuming I can now see your screen.
We'll stop sharing other screens. Yes, please. Alrighty. So we just put this one up for a second while I jump in. No problems at all. Just got to get rid of this in the background. There we go. Okay, won't be a second, everybody. Thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, I'm very sorry, but it had changed, so I don't know what had happened.
That's all right. Oh, we're fine. Yeah, you can just flick it in the tiniest little... Here we go. Got it. Now, share screen, my PowerPoint. Here we go. You just tell me, Deborah, when you're ready to flick across. That's absolutely fine.
Thank you.
And I will be the hostess with the bestest screen toggling you've ever seen. Everyone's happy there. Everyone can see that. So that's the way. So perfect. Let's just see up the chats there. Thank you so much. So here we go. Just before we begin, let's acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the land on which we meet today and their continuing connection to the land and the waters and the communities of Australia. And we repay our respects to them and to their elders, past, present and emerging. And this afternoon, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Deborah Blackman, who's the head of the School of Business at the University of Canberra. She's a member of the Public Service Research Group at the School of Business at the University of New South Wales in Canberra. Her interests include public sector policy implementation, systems level change, employee performance management, organisational learning and organisational effectiveness. And one of the first research papers I ever read, actually, and then I realised, oh my goodness, it's you, Deborah, that actually wrote this paper or was leading the paper. Deborah was the lead researcher on a joint collaborative project with the Australian Public Service Commission, and they wrote the paper called Strengthening the Performance Framework. And the result was a new framework for diagnosing the effectiveness of performance management systems, and the tool is being used in a large range of contexts and organisations. Whenever the other connection is Deborah's actually my current supervisor for my professional doctorate. And whenever she speaks, I just pick up the pen and I start to listen and learn. So I'm very grateful, Deborah, for you coming on the line and sharing your wisdom and knowledge and experience with us as you talk to us about performance conversations, why we need different and not more. So thank you. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to stop my video so that it's easier to concentrate on the slides. It's great that you started talking about the strengthening the performance framework work, because that's really where this talk has emerged from over the subsequent years. Because as a result of the work that we did, people kept saying, so we need to talk to people more, we need to have more conversations. And it became very common that we should be having more and more conversations, and we have to have checks in and all of those kind of things. And I kept thinking, yeah, that's not it. That's part of it, but it's not it. And it took me quite a while, and it took the team, and we spent some time thinking about it. And it was when we started to really think about performance management and change and how they fit together that it became a bit clearer to me that the problem was we kept wanting more of the same conversation, and actually that's not useful. And this links with something I talk about all the time, which is if you're having the same conversation more than once, actually it's clearly not going to change anything, because what we have to remember is, why do we have conversations? And so what I want to talk about today is, I do want to talk a little bit about high performance, because it matters that we think about it in that way. I want to talk very briefly about change and why it fails. Then I want to make that overt link between performance management and change management, because it always amazes me that they are seen as being different things in different parts of the organization. And I spend a lot of time trying to get people to bring them together. And then I'm going to talk about the conversational types. And then there we go. Then we'll conclude. And I've said to Natalie, I will try to make sure I keep an eye on the chat, but in case I fail to see questions, she's going to interrupt me if necessary. So if we go to the next slide then, please, Nat. So the first thing is, what do I mean by performance management? And as you see here, it says a mechanism that underpins and integrates other management practices. And the reason why we use this as our definition is because we see performance as something that emerges out of a whole range of other things. And Natalie knows me well, and she will know that I tend to think in systems. And so for me, performance is the integration of all sorts of subsystems which come together to be the outcome is a change in performance. And it's something that's going to be different, and it's something that's going to be shaped into be something that we want it to be. And that's really important as we move forward, because that's, for me, performance management is exactly that. It's about the shaping and the influencing of the way that people are going to behave in the organization. And that's how whenever we do any of our work, that's where we're starting from. Thanks, Nat. And that then links with the idea of, why do we talk about high performance and why is it so hard to attain? One of the things that really struck me when we did the strengthening the performance work was that we would ask people to say, so can you define high performance? And they would say, oh, well, I know exactly what I don't want. And I would say, well, that's fine, but what do you want? And they would always revert back to telling me what they didn't want. And this is part of the problem, because then we end up with the things that we've got on the screen here. We end up with multiple perspectives, we have different expectations, different experiences. And the example that I usually give, and I don't like to encourage people to be badly behaved in meetings, but if you're anything like me, there are days when you get kind of bored. As long as it's not ones I'm chairing, I have a tendency to ask people, okay, I just want you to stop a minute and tell me what it will look like if it's working, if we have knowledge management or systems thinking, or my favorite, agility, because I can never quite get past that in my gym lessons at school. What is it, if we're trying to do this thing, whatever it is that we're talking about, what does that actually look like for each of us? And the example I often give when I'm talking is motivation. So you ask people what it will be if somebody's motivated. And they will say, oh, well, somebody will work harder, or somebody will be more autonomous and take decisions, or somebody will be happier. Now, all of those are really good answers, but they're very different answers. And what that means is we've got people in a room with completely different picture in their head of what it is they're trying to do. And so if they can't define high performance, then it's going to be very difficult to achieve it. And I'll come back later on to give an example of the importance of thinking about high performance as we start to set up new conversations. communication styles are going to be important, and this, who knows what it looks like, and there's many more. But so there's lots of reasons why high performance is hard, but the most fundamental one, I think, is that because of our different backgrounds, we don't necessarily have a shared view of it, and I will come back to that later. Okay, now, but there's a couple of things I want to talk about right at the beginning, just kind of not necessarily put them to bed, because they'll probably raise questions with people, but there's a couple of things I really need to do. So one of them is talking about culture, because one of the things that worries me when we're talking about performance is I will be asked, and I often am asked, to, can you come and help me set up a learning culture? Can you help me set up a performance culture? And the assumption is that we will change the culture and then we'll do something. And if you look at the picture, it's like we'll set up the culture. From that, we can identify the behaviors which we can reward, and then that will become the norm. And the problem is that's not how culture grows. Next slide, please. Culture actually grows out of symbols and rituals and stories, which we observe and we absorb and we see, it becomes part of it. In other words, the behaviors that we see become the culture that we want. And so what we've actually got to do if we want to change the culture is identify the behaviors we want. This is where high performance and defining it is so important. And then think about how do we reward those behaviors so that they become the norm, so then we get the culture. And that means that, first of all, there's some important things about that, which are that we talk about how long it takes to change culture. Well, it does. It takes a long time. And so if we keep looking at the end state, we lose the point of the movement in between. And so we've got to think about how we really think about what is it we want and how do we hold on to that. And that's why performance management is so important, because culture, a performance culture is actually going to be emerging from the performance we already have and not the other way up. So I want to make that really clear, because to me that helps shape the conversations I'm going to talk about later on. And if we can go on to the next page, please. The other thing I want to say just early on is, this for me is one of my favorite slides. Of course, it's very silly, but it's very important, which is the issue of agency. Who actually has agency? Who can make choices and who makes decisions? And so the example I was giving Natalie last night, and it's one I use quite often, is that when I first took over in one job, I said, right, this is what I really want to do. This is how I want to do it. And I was told quite seriously by somebody that the policy wouldn't let me do that. And I said, oh, that's very sad. Oh, okay. So can you introduce me to the policy? And obviously they looked at me as if I'm crazy, but I'm used to that. It happens a lot. And they kind of shuffled a bit. And I said, well, clearly, if the policy won't let me do that, then I need to talk to the policy so I can explain why I think this is really important, and we can have a discussion about it and we can change it. And so once they'd stopped shuffling, I said, so the absolute question, obviously, is not that the policy won't let me, but who writes the policy? At which point, after a bit of shuffling, they worked out that I wrote the policy now in my new job. And I said, right, well, I'm going to have a very strong chat with myself tomorrow, and then we're going to change the policy, because clearly the policy is not working for what it is we need to do in terms of our purpose. And so I often encourage people to say, how often do you hear the words the organisation thinks, the policy says? Because actually you're ascribing agency to something that doesn't have agency. And when we're trying to do performance management, we've got to really think about, where is the agency? Where are the points where we can influence? What do we have control over? Where does the agency sit? Because without that, we can't possibly shape what it is we want to do differently in the future. So those are the kind of things that I've got in my head when I'm starting to think about performance systems and change systems. Next slide, please.
And Deborah, just before we go on, could I ask you, because I needed to double check with you recently as well, could you just give us a quick definition of agency again too? So you said it's about who has the choices, what is their choice. Could you just give us that definition again?
Yeah, so agency is about, I'm empowered, I can make a decision, I have a choice. So agency is about choice. It means I can choose to do something, I can choose not to. So if you take the example of one that Natalie and I were talking about yesterday, was values-based culture. There's an assumption that if we make a nice picture of what are the values and we tell everybody about them, people will then adopt them. But actually everybody has an agency to make that choice or not. And so what you're doing with performance management is you're recognizing that agency and you're trying to work out how you can encourage somebody to make the decision that you want them to do. I mean, if you like, in a way, behavioral economics and all nudge theory is about saying we think we can shape people's agency because people have choices, they can make decisions. And only decisions, only agency will actually lead to a change in behavior.
Thank you.
Does that help now?
Yeah, absolutely. Very useful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And the other thing I think that's useful to think about as we come in as well is that you can only change your behavior if you know something new. And it doesn't mean that it might be a new piece of knowledge, but that you understand it in a different way, that it's conceptualized differently for you. But if that doesn't change, then you can't do anything different. And again, I'll come back to that in a little while as well. So we've now got the picture of the characteristics of high-performing organizations. And the reason that that's there is because when we did the work in the Strengthening the Performance Management framework, we had a look at what were the characteristics of high-performing organizations. What is it that we want people to be able to do? And the reason we did this was because there's lots of measurements around it, which are around often very financial, or about success. What does it mean? But we were more interested in the characteristics. What were the things you could find were the common things that underpinned the capacity to do that? So not what they did, but the capacity to do it. And these are not surprising. None of this list will be a surprise to you. But what is, for us, the critical part is all of these shape and are shaped by performance management of one form or another. And things like role clarity and purpose became critical when we were trying to understand what was the difference between achieving high performance or not, for example. Cooperative partnerships, how do we collaborate? How do we behave? How do we encourage that? So if you think about it, a lot of the time, and I talk a lot to people about this, we say we want to work in a team, and this is classic stuff that you all know, but we reward individuals. So now we've got no alignment, no clarity, and people have got two things that they're looking at. Am I going to do what you tell me you want me to do, or am I going to tell you, am I going to do what you're rewarding me to do? So we can see how all of this is so wrapped up in the performance that we do, and not just the obvious performance management. But the thing that struck me all the time, and still does when I go out into organizations, is how performance management is seen as something that is other. It's not what we do every day, but actually every conversation we have with somebody, we're having it because we want to shape the way they see the world. I mean, sometimes you just ring up because you want to have a chat. But even that, I mean, at the moment in COVID-19, I'm making a point of talking to every one of my team every week. It's a catch-up, yes, but it's also it's an important symbol. It's about making sure they're okay. It's about giving permission to not be okay. It's about a whole bunch of things. It's about shaping the way they see their world. So every conversation does that, and that's why this is so important. Next, please. And that brings me on to my idea of what is change. So you've got the definitions there to make the form, nature, content, future course of something different, to become different or undergo alteration. Can you press the screen, please? Yeah. And so then it's about what matters about these definitions. Well, what matters about them is that at the end of it, something will be different, which sounds obvious. But often we forget what the purpose was. And this is, for me, the difference. It's the difference between are we going to achieve the purpose that we wanted, or are we just going to get something? And if you think about many structural changes, people get so bogged down by the restructuring that they forget why it was supposed to happen. I always worry when I hear that a structure is a strategy, because it's not. It can never be a strategy. It can only ever be a tactic. And one of our biggest problems, I think, and I'm kind of wandering off as I tend to do sometimes, is we try to have structural solutions for non-structural problems. And with change, when we do that, we forget where it was we were going. Next slide, please. And this is partly because of the way some people see the world. So I see the world from a constructionist view. And what that means is that I think everything we do changes the way we see the world, and therefore change cannot be linear. So a structural functionalist view of the world is that you can plan your change, you can work out what it's going to do, you can break it all down, you can change your structure, everything will be fine, and you can predict what's going to happen. which I think is a lovely idea, but not one I can live with. Whereas for me, everything is emergent. It changes over time and depending on who we talk to. Now, you'll have heard, managers described as the kind of person who is influenced by the last person they spoke to, and that's how we get the strategy. So we know that happens. And one of my favorite quotes is this one from Ford, and it says, "It's more like experimental theatre." This is talking about change, in that the script is being written while the play is being performed. And I don't know if any of you have ever heard about a play called Tamara, which I think is still running. It's in the States, and it has several stages. And you can make choices. So back to agency, Natalie. You can make choices, which is when you go in, you can either just stand as you would normally in front of the stage and watch it all happen, and that will make perfect sense. But the other thing you could do is you could choose to follow somebody and go and see what happens to them. So everybody can go into the play, but they all come out with different experiences. And they will all have a different view of the world when they leave. So what we can think about with change is, if that's the case, then it's how do we shape change? And one of my favorite authors is somebody called Donella Meadows, and she talks about dancing with the system, that you can't force it, but you can shape it and you can work with it. And that's, in a way, what this conversational perspective is all about. Next slide, please.
Deborah, just before you go on too, because you're talking about the systems there with Donella Meadows, and Chris has actually asked a question, just a clarifying question, when you talk about vertical and horizontal system alignment and the importance of that. And we were talking about that in relation to the high performance organizations. So you mentioned Donella Meadows and systems thinking. So could you just give us a quick explanation of what you meant by vertical and horizontal system alignment, particularly as it relates to performance organizations and the conversation we're having here?
Absolutely. Okay, so we're actually, yes. So if we think about vertical is more often clearly understood, which is we have the organizational purpose, for example, and then we have to work out what does that mean for the subdivisions, which I think are the subsystems, and what's their purpose, and how do we align the goals of a department to work into the bigger part of the organization. And then we work out what the teams have to do and what's their purpose, and then what does the individual do. So that's what I mean by vertical alignment, that all the purpose flows up and flows down, so that each part does its bit to build up to the overall purpose. And I think most of us are used to the cascading of goals, and that's what we really mean by vertical alignment. Horizontal alignment is the one that frequently causes more. Everybody talks about it, but they're not very good at it. And if I work in the HR space, people, we've got recruitment, we've got performance management, we've got learning and development, we've got them, and they're all separate. And because everybody thinks that because they've cascaded down the goals to each department, that will be okay. But actually, what people forget is that each change that is made in one, this comes back to this constructionist view. If you change a bit in recruitment, so for example, if you decide that you can't find exactly the right person for the job, but this is the best person, but that's going to have an impact on L&D, because they're going to need to now think about how are they going to support that person. But frequently, that's not how it actually works. And then outside, you've got all sorts of other people making decisions, which in systems terms, they create a lever which changes the behavior and the way that things are working. And so I think in pictures, and this might help for some of you. So for me, I always think of those wonderful old clocks where all the cogs are going around and everything's moving and everything works perfectly. But if you move one bit, the whole lot falls apart. Now that's a bit extreme. But what happens when we haven't got vertical alignment is one system is changing, and it's changing another system without the people necessarily realizing what's going on. And that's when we end up with unintended consequences. We get competition that we weren't expecting, all that type of thing. So does that help with that, Natalie? Does that
Yes.
make sense to you?
Yes, thank you. We're getting some thumbs up as well.
Okay,
so thank
that's
you.
Great.
Thank
Lovely.
you.
So that then brings me on to, why do I link change with conversations? And I've sort of already started to talk about that. But if an organization is a network of conversations, then that's where the reality comes from for the individuals. And we know this because otherwise we wouldn't have the problems with gossip and informal communication, creating different messages going around the organization. So performance conversations then can really support the development of the new realities. And I think that's a really important part of this. And one of the things I find very strange when I'm doing any work with organizations is frequently I will say, so what's the strategic aim of your performance management processes for this year. And people look at me and they go, what do you mean? I said, well, it's a very expensive thing you're about to go through. What strategically do you want it to do? And they say, well, we want it to assess performance. And I'm like, yeah, but it's going to shape performance. What do you want it to shape? And that is not the conversation that people are used to. So if you think about that, if you're trying to have organizational change and that you've got all that happening and you've got performance management, but you're not using those conversations to shape that change, it's a really lost opportunity. And that's why I keep trying to get people to put them together. Okay, next slide, please. I just like this one more than anything else. But it does show us how we get stuck into not talking to people. And in fact, not that long ago, there was a problem going on with one of my team, and I said, right, so we need to get this clarified. She said, yes, I'm going to send another email. And I said, no, you're absolutely not. And I held up my mobile phone and I showed it to her in the days when we could still be in a room and talk to each other. And I said, I want to introduce you to my telephone, because I want you to remember what it does. I need you to talk to them. I need you to go and talk to them. If you can't actually do that, then phone them. But please do not send another email. This is not helping, because this is not a conversation. This is a one way and then another one way, and we need to have the conversation. So I guess for me, it's about that. We've sort of forgotten that we need to have that ongoing interactivity, which is where we actually get the new ideas coming from. Next. And I mentioned earlier on the issue about shared understanding. One of the things that struck me, I think, the most in the last couple of years, we started to do training around the conversation types that I'm going to come on to in a minute. We were doing lots of development around it. And the thing that caused the most surprise, and I couldn't believe it, was the idea that if there's no shared understanding, there can be no conversation. And I always give the example of language, which is that if you're speaking in French to somebody who is German and they don't speak French and you don't speak German, you cannot communicate. There is no shared understanding, and you can eventually, over a period of time, start pointing at things and tell each other the words, and eventually over time you can start to communicate, but it's difficult. And it's the same if you, in a way, it's the same as Natalie just asking me about what's horizontal integration. I know what it means, but if it doesn't mean anything to you, then you can't take that in. So I think of every individual as, everybody has the limit of what they understand. And if there's nothing inside your understanding, then it's very hard to bring something new in. And so if you're talking to somebody who has no shared understanding of any of the words or any of the ideas, it doesn't matter how hard, they can't understand you. An example I will give you is with one of the groups I was working with. They were talking about the conversation they were preparing for. And I said, all right, so what are you planning to do? And this person said, oh, well, I've got this person and we've told her that she needs to change. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting. That sounds like a waste of everybody's time. Oh, no, well, she's agreed she's got to change. And I said, right, so you've had 4 conversations, yep. And they've agreed to change, yep. And they haven't changed, no. So you're going to tell them they need to change again, yes. And they're going to agree, yes. Does this not, do you not get a Groundhog Day about all of this? So I said, well, clearly you do not have a shared understanding of what it will look like if that person changes. Do they know how to change? Do they know what you mean? Or have you just kept telling them, going back to what I said earlier, what you don't want? So if we can go to the next slide, please. I said, because if there's no shared understanding, and can you press that one again, please? If there's no shared understanding, if there's no overlap, it doesn't matter how many times you have that conversation, it's never going to change. And so if you keep having the same conversation, the chances are that there is no shared understanding of what it is you're doing. So the next conversation has to be about how do you create the shared understanding and what does it need to be of before you can actually move forward in any way. And so many times the conversation is not working because you're just, you're basically, you're being very polite, but it's equivalent to shouting at each other. And this is critical for what we're about to talk about next. But as I said, I was really surprised how, when I drew this picture, it changed the way people were thinking about the conversations that they were having. Next, please. And so this really is kind of where we're up to. How do we change a conversation so that we can actually create change? And my 2 favorite questions all the time are, what do you want to be different and what might it look like if it works? And they are questions I use all the time to change the conversation that I'm having, because people will be telling me what the problem is, they'll be telling why things aren't working, they'll start with all sorts of stuff, and I say, let's stop, let's work at the other end. For some people, this is similar to appreciative inquiry. I don't go as far with that, but it's about changing the question, and I'm thinking that through. Next, please. So here we are. So what happened was, I was thinking a lot about conversations and the types of conversations that needed to happen. And I realized that, as I said earlier, right at the beginning, people were having more conversations, but they were having more of the same conversation. And bearing in mind what I've just said, which is the idea of, if you don't have a shared understanding, then how can you possibly have the conversation? The chances are there were more of the same conversation. And if it wasn't working to start with, having it again wasn't going to help. And then I came across this typology, which I think is particularly useful. And what it says is that there are 4 types of conversation. And what you need is to recognize that A, they have to be done in an order, that they each have a different purpose, and that many times the problem is, as you'll see in a little while, that we start with the wrong one. So, not surprisingly, the initiative conversation is how we start changes, act as a new input or stimuli to the mental model. The mental model being the way that I view my world, that understanding, that circle that we had earlier on. Explaining why, triggering ideas, and suggesting the need for alternatives. And it can be a really short conversation. So some of the best initiative conversations I've ever seen have been somebody, and remember this, when I talk about performance, remember it can go up as well as down, is somebody setting the seed in somebody else's head to be able to have a conversation later. So I bought a new car last year, and you're thinking, how is that relevant? Well, I did a little bit of research and I decided which car I wanted, and I bought this car that I knew nothing about. And then I went out, I realized everybody had bought the same car. And obviously it wasn't like that at all. But what happened is, now in my world, I now see that car all of the time. And we realized that once we've got a trigger in our brains, we see things differently. And I know there are people, for example, who like to think about something just before they go to sleep, because in the morning they'll wake up and the very clever filing system that is our heads will have got said, oh, thank goodness, downtime, I'll go and find it for you. So we know that all sorts of things go on in our brain that we don't really understand. And one of the things is that once we've been made aware of something, we hear about it all the time. And so if you seed something to somebody, you don't have to sit them down and have a conversation. But you say to somebody, rather than saying, I want to talk to you on Friday, can we set up a meeting? You say, you know, such and such, I need to talk about this, and explain it a little bit. Can we discuss that? Now, it doesn't take much longer, but now in their head is a whole expectation, and they don't even realize it. But next time they're at a meeting, they're going to hear things differently from the way they did before. So initiative conversations are making the space for novelty, or they're making the space for change. And sometimes they will need to be quite long ones where you can sit down and talk to people about all the reasons why it might need to happen. But the really important thing about here is at no point do you come up with a solution, because people are not necessarily ready. So the other thing about the initiative conversation is it's about preparing people. And my favorite example is one of my colleagues. So I was giving this talk once, and she came up to me afterwards and she said, oh, that explains Oscar. And I said, start with, who is Oscar? And she said, that's my son. And she said, he's a sculptor and he's been having problems finding a studio and all sorts of things. And she said, so I'm going to sell the house. And I suddenly realized that what I could do was I could buy a new place, and I could have a small place down the bottom built for Oscar and a studio and everything. And that would be great. And so she went into Oscar and she said, Oscar, I've had this great idea. I'm going to move and you can move as well. And then you can come and live with me and all of these things. And what did he hear? What he heard was, my mother thinks at 27 I should come home and live with her again. And that is not what she meant at all. Now, 2 weeks later, she found him online looking up real estate, because now he'd been able to think about it. But often, particularly as managers, we're ready for the conversation. In our head, We've probably had the conversation in the shower, we've redone it in the car, we know what we want to talk about, the person comes in, we start to talk about it, and they are just sitting there looking at us as if we have completely lost our minds, and the chances are we sort of had. So they're not ready for the conversation. It's not that and I've seen readiness for change. Well, it's partly about readiness for change. Many of these people are ready for change, but they didn't know it was happening now, and they're not ready for the conversation. And one of the things, if I'm in a big room, I will ask everybody who thinks, who thinks by talking, to put their hands up. The sort of people who, they wave their hands about and they want to talk and they have their ideas and it's all verbalized and they're having a lovely time. And I ask them to put their hands up. And then I say, right, who are the people who like to just sit and think and read? And they put their hands up. And I said, and how much do those of us who like to talk out loud and think out loud annoy you? And there was usually laughter, because it's true. So the people who need time to think are sitting in that room with us talking at them, completely bemused. So this comes back to the conversation styles I talked about earlier on. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why we need to have initiative conversations. But they're about enabling people to start thinking. But the really important thing is, at no point do you try to solve it. Yes, deep thinkers are often introverts. I agree, because I've just seen that comment go through. Next, please. So the next one is understanding. And this one frequently happens 2 or 3 times. So this is the one where we actually develop the shared ideas, the shared view of whatever it is we're trying to do, whether it's what it will look like, and particularly what it will look like if it's working, what the options are, what the resources are. So we talk about the concepts. We actually really build up an understanding of the issue. And as I said, sometimes that has to happen 2 or 3 times. And one example is when we were setting up a new website, and I'd given permission, I thought, to be really quite radical and do something new. And the first meeting that came back, and they were already starting to try and build the website, and it looked exactly the same. And it was all, and we need to put this in, and I said, stop, hang on a minute. All of this is all about us again. What I asked you to do was to think about what the user wants, and, understanding that before we go any further. Do you understand what the user wants? No, but we need to do all of these things. I said, stop, let's go back. So we sat again and we talked about it, and I had to give permission again and again. In fact, I think it took 5 times in the end. But by the end, we were really beginning to get something different. And the other example is, I think it was Honda, and they were doing the Skunk Works years ago. They sent their novelty team away 4 times, because each time they was trying to develop the car for I think it was the 23rd century. And each time it came back, they said, it still looks like a car. So, please think about that, and pushing people so that the understanding is there. Okay. So is there a question from Nathan? I've just seen something go past.
No, I just encouraged him to pop a message into the chat box if he needed
to. Just so you know, I can't see raised hands, so
yeah,
that's okay.
That's right. Yeah, I saw the hand raised. So if anyone wants to pop a message into the chat box, they're more than welcome to. Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you. So what that means is the performance conversation is the 3rd conversation, and this is almost always where we start. So we almost always start by trying to generate action and getting on with it, because we're all very busy and we've got to get on. And one of the fascinating things about this, and lots of people say to us, oh, well, this is a really lovely idea, but we just haven't got time for this. And so I ask, how many times have you had the same conversation or multiple conversations with people about the same thing? And they go, yeah, quite often. I said, right, so you might end up with the same number of conversations if you do this, but I suspect you'll get a better outcome. And as I'll come back onto in a little while, there is actually growing evidence that that's the case. So actually at the performance conversation, that is the time that we finally make the plan, we clarify what will be different. Now, depending how complex the thing is, it may be that we can do that on the 2nd or 3rd conversation. Usually it's probably about the 4th or 5th. This also means that if you think about performance management as a process, you've got to start to think about how do you set this up so that you don't automatically start with the tasks or the to-do list, which if you're not careful, we end up with. And So how do we set the space for people to be thinking about things in a different way? How do we get a shared understanding of what the purpose of this is? I found it quite interesting at the moment because we have, as every organization does, very, very we have quite complex performance management systems, and in a context of COVID, there's a lot of concern that people won't be able to achieve their targets. And I've been bemused, frankly, about people saying, well, I think we should stop our performance. You know, we shouldn't have our career conversations. We shouldn't have our performance conversations. It's not fair on people. And I said, well, surely what we need to do is then start the cycle, not change it completely, but go back and say, right, how has the context changed? How can we understand the differences? And then do it that way. Never has it been more important to have those conversations. But it means that we need to go through the cycle again and not just start with, can you do that thing? And so I've been having to try and shape that conversation with our leadership team. And one more, please, Nat. And then we have closure conversations, provide completion, sustain the changes made. And you might think, well, when do you have these? Well, obviously, sometimes a change has been done and you talk about it and you reflect on it and you don't talk about it again. And sometimes this is about when you realize that something can't change unless people leave something behind. The most extreme version of this I ever heard, and I promise you this is a true example, is when there had been a very, very big recruitment policy change in one of the big departments. And the irony was 5 years before there'd been another policy change and everybody had hated the policy that they were now changing. So policy 1 had gone, policy 2 had come in. The policy 2 is the one that's just going, and there's now going to be policy 3. But everybody loves policy 2, loves it, loves it, loves it. And in the end, one day the manager came in and she said, right, tomorrow, I want you all to bring some kind of tea or coffee or your favorite beverage. I want you all to bring some kind of cake or snack or whatever you want. We're going on a little bit of a field trip. Won't be long. We're only going to the park, but you need to be ready to go for kind of a morning tea in the park. So off they went. And when they got there, they found she'd made a little coffin, and in it was policy 2. And she said, right, we're going to have a wake because policy 2 is dead. We have to understand that policy 2 is dead. It's never going to come back. Every conversation that starts with, we're going to miss it, it's going to be sad, is no longer helping us. We have to have a wake. We have to talk about why it was so lovely. And then tomorrow we have to go and deal with policy 3. So it's the most extreme closure conversation I've ever come across. But there are times when you do need to do it. When, if you're not careful, you have to say, and this is when you've been having the same unhelpful conversation. Actually, you're closing that conversation and you're working out how to close it quite overtly, and then moving on to the next one. So another more personal example, a student who had quite legitimately had an appalling supervision, but every conversation was about that. And in the end, I had to say to her, look, I cannot help you with that. Nothing will ever change that. But I can help your future. Which would you like? So there are times when we actually have to have a closure conversation, because unless we do that, we can't start the initiative one. So that's why that is such an important one. But it says provide completion. So it may be completion of something positive. It may be completion of something negative. But it can also be about sustaining, working out what you don't want to lose. So many of you are in the middle of COVID-19, well, we all are. Many of you will be just starting to think about recovery. And I don't like the word recovery personally, because it has so many connotations of trying to get back to where we were. What we're actually trying to do is come back to somewhere new, because we've all learned how to do things that we could not do before. We are on, 64 of us are on this on this conference. We did this before, but it wasn't our norm. And I think it will be much more of our norm in future. So one of the things many of us are trying to do at the moment is capture the things that have worked, so that when we then start again, we don't go back to the old conversations, we start new ones and we do something different. And in the education space, I have no idea where that's going to go, but I think it's something that's going to be really, really important as we move forward. Next slide, please. So why does this matter? Now, coming back to that, thank you for asking me the question earlier, Natalie, about integrated alignment. Change needs that alignment of ideas. It needs these things to be knitted together, and conversations are a way to create that knitting. because in the conversations, you often find out what people are thinking in ways that you otherwise wouldn't. And you can then start to talk about things that you might not talk about in other ways. But it also gives you that opportunity to start something, to work it through, and to think about it. So one of the issues for me is often, you know, I hear people, oh, we've got to do something about this. And you think, well, we do, but actually we can't do that yet. What are the things we've got to do first so that we can move to something else, and this is particularly around horizontal alignment. What are we going to have to shape before we can do the next thing? And so that's why this matters. It matters because you can't get what you can't explain. So back to my previous example of the person who knew what they didn't want but didn't know what they did want. I kept pushing him, what do you want? What do you want? And he said, well, and eventually he articulated. And I said, okay, so what are the skills that will be required to do that different thing? And he told me, and I said, does she know how to do those things? And he said, no, probably not. I said, right, so stop having the conversation about what you want or don't want. Go and have a conversation about the skills that you think she needs, and her behavior will change automatically. But if you can't explain what you want, you can't possibly get it. Conversation readiness needs preparation. So one of the things we do in the development that we do is I get people to map out what they think the conversations will look like, what the purpose of each one is going to be and why it's different. So what's the overall purpose of the conversational set and what they need to do for each one so that they'll know that they're ready to move to the next one. And getting them to go through that is quite fascinating in terms of the fact that most of them always start with the performance conversation and you have to pull them back up. But also the realization that they think they have to drive it all the time. And one of the example was that if you, it was somebody who was saying, oh, I need to make sure everybody does this. And it's like, well, back to, do they have the shared view of what this is going to be? And on that conversation, slowly but surely, it became clear that she thought she had to have all the ideas. And that we could then change that to say, well, no, actually, if you've had the initiative conversation and the understanding conversation, then things will come up. And if we're seeing Nathan's point is, you know, I like to frame closure as an ultimately mutually agreed upon solution. Yeah, that's great. You both know where it is you want to be. Now, how can all of you help yourselves get there? And when she came back for the second session, she had a very different view of how she was doing things because she'd opened up the conversations. But by always starting with the performance conversation, she wasn't allowing that openness. And then, as I've already mentioned, slowing things down may speed things up because you slow down, you prepare for the conversation much more carefully, the series of conversations. You have an idea of when each one has been successful, and it does slow things down, but you've got a much better chance of getting actual change, as in different behavior at the end of it. And that's what you're really aiming for. And so when we were talking to people about the examples, one of the examples we got was somebody who said that, and this is a really classic one that we do all the time, we finally get into our manager's office and we've got this list of things we need to do. And she said, I realized that by the second one, he simply wasn't listening. And by the fourth, he'd probably playing solitaire, I don't know, she said. But she realized that to actually get movement, she needed to do two things, no more. I mean, there's lots of people in communications who say no more than three things, but she'd chosen two. And she would make sure she was getting traction on those, and then she would go. So she said, I think about it much more carefully, and I'm always thinking that you can move, I'm always thinking about how I can get things moving. She said, I've got far more done in much shorter meetings in the last 2 weeks. So she was completely rethinking the way that she was interacting with her manager, whereas because we can't get time with them, we try to do everything all at once and it becomes a performance list. But she said, actually, I've realized I'm not getting anywhere with that. So now I'm doing a completely different way of doing that. And what she was doing was she was actually combining the conversations, but not trying to have the same conversation about something, but doing a performance bit on one thing and seeding the understanding at the same time. She said, I'm not actually doing closure at the moment, but we will be coming to that later. So that's an example of slowing things down, but actually speeding things up. And I think the next slide says shared models need work. Okay, I'd put that one separately because I wanted to clarify it. this is one of the key things that has come out from all the work, is that we have to have shared mental models, and that they need us to actively think about it. What is it the person does not share a view of? So back to Nathan and the shared idea of the solution. If there is no shared solution, we can't get there. But what are the other things? What are the words that we're using that we think we understand and it turns out that we don't? What are the assumptions that we're making that are framing the way we're thinking about it, and realizing that people can't hear us? So, you know, the word change in and of itself causes confusion. And at the moment, you know, if one of the issues with restructuring is they can be very valuable, but they also mean that everybody is very nervous and frightened and they can't hear as well. So therefore, what people are hearing is very, very different all the time. So yeah, shared mental models need work. That it's not something that happens all the time, instantly, but we need that sharing if we're going to move forward. Next, please. There you go. I thought I was at the end. So I hope that was something of what you wanted, Natalie, and I'm very happy to obviously answer more questions if there are some now.
Well, absolutely. Thank you, Deborah. Yeah, let's throw the line open and see what comments people might have. So thank you. We do have 10 minutes, so let's take advantage of.
Right. So I've just seen Joy has asked, how does this link to design thinking? And the answer is it can or it might not. I think design thinking, and I've worked with people who do that all the time, and design thinking is about developing empathy, and you could argue that some of the initiative and understanding conversations are definitely about developing empathy. I think for me this is more it's more of a micro thing. It's something that we do all the time, whereas design thinking tends to be more of a macro, bigger picture thing, but they're clearly very related. Both of them are about trying to make sure that we understand what's happening, but I think this one is probably more of a day-to-day practice for me versus a major thing. Does that make sense? I can't see Joy, does that make sense, Joy? Okay, great. All right. Any other questions, thoughts? People want to argue. Very happy with arguing. It's one of my favorite things. Ask Nat.
I've got more to write this weekend, that's for sure.
Would I like to comment on the systems thinking linked to Seng's learning communities? Probably not in the way you'd like me to. The thing about learning communities, there's nothing wrong, you know, so learning communities are great. My problem with learning communities, I think, is that if you're not careful, it's the culture problem again. It's what are we learning for, and why are we learning, and what do we think that's going to do? So probably in spirit of full disclosure, I spent quite a lot of my PhD thesis saying why I thought that Senga was at least incomplete. And part of that was that there was an assumption, and there were a lot of assumptions in the learning literature, that if people are learning, something magical will happen. And I'm not saying it won't, but there's no reason why it should. So you've got to think about, well, again, it's back to what's the purpose. So if the purpose of a learning organization is that it's going to be innovative and it's going to change, then how are you going to make sure that that happens? And some examples that I was giving in when I was doing my work were that if we're not careful, we do so much shared learning and we all learn the same things that actually we reduce the capacity for innovation because nobody can see something that's different. And this is why shared mental models are really important in order to start a conversation. But you'll see I only had an overlap, because if they were actually the same, then there's no capacity for difference and there's no capacity for novelty. So the idea of a learning community is a great thing, but you've got to think about how are you then going to make sure that it creates what you want it to do. And that was always my problem with it, is that people would ring me up. You can't see me, but I'm 5 foot nothing, and people used to ring me up and say, we'd like you to develop a learning culture. And I'd say, well, fine, why do you want that? And well, people will then learn. It's like, well, yes, but what in your head you have an assumption that this will fix a problem. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think the answer is there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. But the idea that it will magically lead to something is always my worry. And so I think it comes back to, what do you want to be different? Yes, and so yeah, it needs updating. Now I think I saw something go about 2 extremes go past, but hang on, let me go back and see if I can find it. Oh, when managers resist change and some are on board, how do you deal with those 2 extremes? That's really interesting, and I'm so glad you asked me that question from Karen. One of the things is that we do assume when we set up a change and we set up communications that everybody's going to respond the same way to it, and inevitably they won't. And there's 2 things about resisting change that I think matter. One is understanding, are they resisting the change or are they resisting the loss? So we use the words resistance to change all the time, and I do wish we wouldn't, because people don't resist change, or the lottery would never happen and people wouldn't buy tickets. We don't resist change, we resist loss of some kind. And so one of the things we've got to look at when we've got managers resisting is, what is it they think they're losing? They may be losing it, they may not. And understanding that perceived loss will help us have a much better understanding of the resistance. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that because we assume that people are going to receive information in the same way, we tend to do one set of messaging. And although we might send messages in different formats, it's fundamentally the same message. So when people say, oh no, you know, we've got lots of channels, it's like, yeah, you've got lots of channels, but you've got the same message. And I'd like you to give you an example, because I've got a couple of minutes. We actually did something a bit different the other day, and it is in the performance management space, where there's an organization that's in the middle of doing a new policy. And I said, well, that's fine, but my view is always that, you know, the policy is a very small part of your problem. You know, how many policies have you had in the last 4 years? And they said, probably about 4. I said, right, and none of them working? No. Okay, we're back to structural solutions for non-structural problems. I said, let's try and find out what is the attitude to performance management before you do this. And so, not surprisingly, we found there were 4 completely different views of the world. The first one was, yep, we know we need a new policy. Just tell us what it is. We'll get on with it. That's fine. We understand this isn't working. That's okay. So they're on board. They're fine. Then we've got the people who said, well, yeah, we can have a new performance management system. But, you know, the reality is that that's not why we've got a capability problem, which is so the performance management is about trying to develop capability. That's not the problem. The problem is we haven't got the right recruitment and we haven't got the right succession planning. And so until we fix that, there's no point in worrying about performance management. So for them, this was an important but secondary problem. The third group of people were saying, I think this is a great idea, but our leaders and managers can't do this. So there's no point in doing it until you've trained them. And then third lot were the ones who were saying, it's never going to work. We're all going to hate it. Da, 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 da. Now, there's no point in talking to them because they're not going to change, but you can deal with that in a minute. So by picking up the 2 groups who could be shaped, suddenly you've got the majority of the organization on board. And then there becomes the impetus to start moving things. And there becomes enough movement that it will start to move, it start to change. But the messaging then came quite different about what you were doing, because it wasn't about all selling why the performance, it was why this is part of a bigger, back to alignment, this is part of a bigger plan. We are doing this, we are doing that, we're doing the management development, we're doing the recruitment changes, this is all part of a bigger picture. Now are you on board? So I don't know if that makes sense, but it's about saying, you know, what are the likely reactions and what are the perceived losses, and where can we go from there? So that's a very long answer, but hopefully there's something in there. And I love the idea of the horses. Yes, you're right. What needs to be understood so that things can move is a fantastic example. Okay, so any other? So somebody said learning communities conversations can lead to excellent coaching opportunities. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the thing, that, you know, nothing is ever good or bad. It's about how do we implement it and how do we make it happen. But there's got to be something shaping it. So, you know, you said coaching opportunities, and that's great. It's if we think that it's going to happen automatically, I think we have the problem. Any more, Natalie, that you can see? How we doing?
I think we've covered it all. There's lots of thank yous coming in through now, Deborah. So perhaps we can actually leave it there because we are right on the hour. So there's been lots of references to writer's cramp and scribbled notes, and I actually encouraged everyone just to listen to you and write down all the coaching questions you ask. And as always, in just 1 hour, I have filled every line of an A4 page with all your brilliant questions that you ask. So thank you so much. You've, as people have said on the chat, you've been able to bring theory to life. You've been able to give us ways of thinking about different conversations, and your generosity just to share so many ideas with us. We're all very, very grateful for, and you can see all the thanks coming through.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. And like Mike says, this is a recording that we're all going to have to listen to again because you share so much.
People.
You share so much with us that we really need to listen to it again. And you know, I know that's going to inform a lot of the writing that I'm going to do on the weekend as well. So once again, on behalf of the Open Door Coaching Group team, on behalf of Synergy Global, and on behalf of everyone that's joined in today, everyone is saying they can't wait to listen to the recording again. So thank you so much, Deborah. We're so grateful for your contribution to our Coach Week and our Coach Week forums.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope I can get to interact with people in different ways in the future. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.